The world knows the name etched into the iconic square bottle, but few know the tragic weight behind the man who put it there. The story of Jack Daniel is not a corporate success fable. It is a tale of a boy who was forged by abandonment and who found his destiny in the shadow of a dark biological process. Born Jasper Newton Daniel around 1850. The exact date lost to a courthouse fire, the first of many historical erasures. Jack was the youngest of 10 children. His mother, Lucinda, died shortly after his birth, leaving a hole in the family that could never be filled. When his father remarried and then died in the Civil War, Jack was left in the care of a stepmother who had no space for him in her life or her heart. At just 7 years old, this tiny, strong-willed boy became a runaway. He was a child of the Tennessee hills, carrying nothing but a sense of survival and a deep-seated need to belong to something permanent. He was taken in by a local lay preacher and moonshiner named Dan Call. It was here, in the blurred boundary between the sacred and the profane, that Jack's true education began. But his most important mentor wasn't the preacher. It was an enslaved man named Nathan Nearest Green. Green was the master distiller for Call's operation, and he possessed a technical knowledge of spirits that was light years ahead of the local White Lightning makers. Green didn't just teach Jack a recipe. He taught him a distinct chemical process rooted in West African traditions of filtration. This was the charcoal mellowing process, the expensive, painstaking method of filtering the raw spirit, drop by drop, through 10 feet of tightly packed sugar maple carbon. This wasn't merely a flavor choice. It was an industrial step intended to strip away fusel oils and bitter compounds, leaving behind a smooth, chemically consistent liquid. Jack, tiny in stature but immense in ambition, was a master student of this alchemy. He realized that this meticulous chemical refinement was the key to creating a product that could travel further and sell for more than generic, rough-edged farm whiskey. In 1866, while still a teenager, Jack made a radical, tragic pivot. After a religious revival swept through the county, Dan Call was forced to choose between the pulpit and the still. He chose the pulpit and sold the business to Jack. At an age when most boys were just beginning their lives, Jack was now a proprietor. He took Green's technical process and registered his distillery with the federal government, becoming the first person in the United States to do so. This was more than a business move. It was an act of self-legitimization. By standardizing a biological process, the sour mash, and marrying it to Green's chemical filtration, Jack was building an industrial engine to replace the family he never had. He had turned his back on the safety of the preacher's home, committing himself to the science of the still. He found a new father figure in the chemistry of carbon and a new religion in the limestone water of Lynchburg, setting in motion a machine that would conquer the world, but would eventually demand a price he never expected to pay. By the 1880s, Jack Daniel was no longer just a distiller. He was an industrialist of the spirit. Yet, despite his growing wealth, he remained a man marked by his small stature, barely 5'2", and a persistent sense of insecurity that drove him to obsess over every technical detail of his production. He understood that a consistent chemical profile required absolute control over raw materials. This obsession led him to buy the Cave Spring Hollow in Lynchburg for $2,148, a massive fortune at the time. This spring was the chemical backbone of his operation. The water flowed from an underground limestone cave, which acted as a natural geological filter, stripping away all iron. In the world of whiskey, iron is a poison. It turns the liquid black and creates a bitter, metallic off flavor that ruins the mellowing. The limestone cave spring removed the iron while adding crucial minerals like magnesium and calcium. These minerals were the biological lifeblood for his proprietary yeast strain. Jack didn't just own the distillery. He owned the geology that made the process possible. He was engineering consistency at a molecular level, turning a natural Tennessee feature into a proprietary industrial ingredient. His next engineering move was the standardization of the mash bill. He set a formula that hasn't changed to this day: 80% corn, the sugar fuel, 12% malted barley, the enzyme provider, and 8% rye, the spicy bite. This was a high-octane biological fuel for his yeast, which he guarded with fanatical obsession. He understood that if this tiny single-celled organism died, the entire industrial identity of Jack Daniel's would be lost. He was practicing a form of molecular logistics, ensuring that the biology of the 1860s was preserved in every modern fermentation tank, effectively cloning the flavor of his youth for eternity. But Jack's defining act of industrial logic came in 1895 with the choice of the square bottle. At the time, round bottles were the industry standard, but for Jack, standard was never enough. Round bottles were a logistical nightmare. They rolled, they broke, and they were difficult to pack efficiently for the expanding rail transport network. Jack, who had spent his life optimizing small things to survive in a world of giants, saw a logistical flaw that others ignored. He chose a fluted, square-sided bottle because it offered superior packing density. A square bottle couldn't roll, it was less prone to breakage due to its structural rigidity, and it allowed more units to be packed tightly into a wooden boxcar with zero wasted space. It was a masterpiece of unit logistics that protected the liquid inside during global transit. Yet, even as the square bottle began to appear in bars from London to St. Louis, the man behind it remained a lonely figure, often seen sitting alone in his office, staring at a massive iron safe. He was building an empire that was perfectly organized, but his own life was becoming increasingly chaotic. He had created a bottle that couldn't roll away, but he was discovering that he couldn't stop himself from drifting further away from the people he tried to love. By 1904, the boy who had run away from a broken home had become the Whiskey King of Tennessee. But success for Jack Daniel was never about the money. It was about the validation of the process he had inherited from Nearest Green. To prove his liquid was technically superior, Jack entered his old number 7 into the St. Louis World's Fair. This was the ultimate industrial arena, a massive 1,200-acre spectacle where the greatest minds of the century showcased their inventions. Competing against established European distilleries with centuries of pedigree, the small man from Lynchburg was the underdog. When the judges awarded the gold medal for the finest whiskey in the world to Jack Daniel, it wasn't just a win. It was a global confirmation of the Lincoln County process. The charcoal mellowed chemistry had officially defeated the traditional methods of the old world. But back in Lynchburg, the glory of the gold medal couldn't mask the darkening reality of Jack's personal life. He had built a massive industrial machine, but he had never built a family of his own. He lived in a fine house, yet he often spent his nights at the distillery, obsessed with the books and the data of his production. He was a perfectionist in an imperfect world, and that friction finally sparked a fatal fire. In 1906, Jack arrived early at his office. He tried to open his massive iron safe, the one that held his records and his gold, but he couldn't remember the combination. In a sudden, uncharacteristic explosion of the rage he had suppressed since childhood, he kicked the heavy safe with his bare foot. It was a small injury, a broken big toe. In the modern age, it would be a footnote. But in 1906, before the industrialization of antibiotics, it was a death sentence. The injury led to blood poisoning and eventually gangrene. Jack's health began a slow, agonizing decline. For 6 years, the man who had mastered the chemistry of filtration watched as his own blood became unfiltered and toxic. The Whiskey King was being killed by his own frustration, a tragic irony for a man who had spent his life engineering the removal of impurities. As he lay dying in 1911, he bequeathed the distillery to his nephew, Lem Motlow. His last words were reportedly a request for a drink of water, the same limestone-filtered cave spring water that had made him a legend, but could no longer save his life. When Jack Daniel died in 1911, The machine he built faced an existential threat that no engineering could solve: prohibition. Even before the national ban in 1920, Tennessee had passed its own restrictive laws, forcing the Lynchburg distillery to go dark. Lem Motlow, Jack's heir, found himself in possession of a world-famous brand that was legally prohibited from existing. For the next 28 years, the massive copper stills sat cold, and the sugar maple charcoal vats grew dry and brittle. The process was frozen in time. But Motlow understood a technical truth that most overlooked. A distillery is more than just pipes and wood. It is a biological lineage. While the physical equipment of the distillery was falling into ruin, Motlow was fighting a desperate, quiet war to keep the proprietary yeast alive. This yeast was the direct descendant of the original strain Jack had used in 1866. It was the ghost in the machine that dictated the specific esters and congeners that gave Jack Daniel's its signature profile. If this single-celled organism died out during the dry years, the whiskey could never truly be recreated. Motlow reportedly kept the yeast working in small, secret batches, moving it between locations like a refugee, ensuring the biological chain remained unbroken. He was preserving the DNA of a ghost, waiting for the political gears of the country to shift. The tragedy of the silent vats era was the loss of human expertise. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, many of the master distillers who had worked under Jack were dead or gone. The tribal knowledge of the Lincoln County process was fading. When Motlow finally won the right to reopen the Lynchburg distillery in 1938, he had to rebuild the industrial engine from the ground up using old sketches and his own memories. He had to source new sugar maple for the charcoal and clear decades of silt from the cave Spring Hollow. The restart was a massive technical gamble. Would the new equipment, combined with the old yeast, produce the same gold medal spirit? The first run after the restart was more than a production cycle. It was an attempt to resurrect Jack himself. When the first drop of White Dog finally dripped through the new charcoal vats, the survivors realized that while the man was gone, the process was immortal. Just as the distillery was finding its rhythm after the long silence of Prohibition, the world was plunged into a conflict that would once again threaten the process. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the industrial gears of the nation were forcibly shifted. The U.S. government ordered all beverage distilleries to cease the production of whiskey and pivot to the manufacturing of high-proof industrial alcohol. This was a logistical gut punch to Lem Motlow. The whiskey that carried Jack's name required years of aging to reach its peak, but the war effort demanded immediate, raw output for use in everything from medical supplies to synthetic rubber and fuel. The Lincoln County process, the soul of the brand, was deemed a luxury the war couldn't afford. The technical toll on the distillery was immense. The massive vats that had just begun to mellow the post-Prohibition spirit were emptied to make room for industrial-grade ethanol. The artisan nature of the slow drip was replaced by the high-velocity demands of military supply chains. For several years, the Cave Spring machine was a soldier in the American Industrial War effort. However, this period created an accidental marketing void that would eventually define the brand's future. Because production had stopped, the existing stock of aged Jack Daniel's became a rare commodity. Soldiers coming home from the front lines carried with them a memory of the square bottle as a symbol of home, of pre-war stability, and of a quality that was now hard to find. The tragedy of the war had created an artificial scarcity, a logistical quirk that turned a regional whiskey into a coveted, high-status object of desire. When the war finally ended and the stills were allowed to return to their original purpose, the demand was staggering. But you cannot overclock a barrel of whiskey. The time required for the spirit to interact with the wood is a fixed biological and chemical constant. Lem Motlow refused to cut corners. He wouldn't shorten the aging or skip the charcoal mellowing to meet the demand. This stubborn adherence to Jack's original slow process meant that for much of the late 1940s, Jack Daniel's was often sold out before it even hit the shelf. The machine was working at maximum capacity, but it was a machine governed by the clock of the seasons, not the speed of the assembly line. Jack's ghost was still in charge, and he was a master who refused to be rushed. By the early 1950s, Jack Daniel's was a cult brand, respected by connoisseurs but still largely unknown to the global masses. That changed because of a single, unplanned endorsement from the biggest star on the planet, Frank Sinatra. Legend says Sinatra first tasted Jack Daniel's at a bar with Jackie Gleason, and from that moment on, he became the brand's unofficial global ambassador. He called it the nectar of the gods and often appeared on stage with a glass in hand. This was the moment the process met the persona. But behind the glamour of the Rat Pack, the distillery was grappling with a massive technical challenge: how to scale a handcrafted, 19th-century process to meet 20th-century global demand without losing the old number 7 soul. The answer lay in the science of the warehouse. As demand skyrocketed, the distillery had to build more rickhouses, the massive multi-story buildings where the barrels age. These are not just storage units, they are natural thermal engines. Unlike some distillers who use climate-controlled warehouses, Jack Daniel's uses the volatile Tennessee weather. In the summer, the heat causes the whiskey to expand and push deep into the charred oak staves of the barrel. In the winter, the cold pulls the whiskey out, bringing with it the vanillin and tannins that provide color and flavor. This is known as the cycle of respiration. To manage this at scale, the distillery's engineers developed a rotation logic, moving barrels to different levels of the warehouse where temperatures vary, ensuring that the chemical interaction between the wood and the spirit was consistent across millions of gallons. This era also saw the industrialization of the cooperage. To ensure the chemical purity of the wood filter, Jack Daniel's remains one of the only distilleries in the world to manufacture its own barrels. They don't use glue or nails. The barrels are held together by the tension of the metal hoops and the swelling of the wood itself. They pioneered a high-speed toasting and charring process where the interior of the white oak is flashed with fire for exactly enough time to create a red layer of caramelized wood sugars. This is the filter that the whiskey lives in for years. Sinatra may have provided the face for the brand, but it was the engineers in Lynchburg, mastering the thermodynamics of the warehouse and the chemistry of the oak, who ensured that the Tragic Boys whiskey lived up to the hype. The man who had run away from home was now the toast of Las Vegas. His name carried on the breath of an icon, even as his bones lay in the quiet Tennessee dirt. By 1956, the Tragic Boys whiskey had grown too large for a family to manage. The heirs of Lem Motlow faced a daunting industrial reality. To conquer the world, they needed the capital of a corporate giant. They sold the distillery to Brown-Forman, a move that transformed the Lynchburg machine into a global technological powerhouse. This was the era of the digital distiller. While the recipe remained unchanged, the process was modernized with surgical precision. The distillery integrated a high-tech sensory laboratory where every batch of White Dog is analyzed using gas chromatography. This ensures that the chemical fingerprint of the spirit, the specific balance of esters, aldehydes, and alcohols, perfectly matches the historical data profile established a century ago. This corporate era also saw the industrialization of the sugar maple supply chain. To maintain the 10-foot charcoal filters, the company became one of the largest consumers of hard sugar maple in the world. They didn't just buy wood, they engineered the burn. They developed a controlled, open-air incineration process where ricks of wood are stacked in a specific log cabin geometry to ensure a clean, oxygen-rich burn. This creates the highest quality of carbonized charcoal, essential for the chemical filtration that defines Tennessee whiskey. They also revolutionized the water logistic. As production scaled to millions of cases, the Cave Springs output had to be managed with incredible care to ensure the local water table wasn't depleted. They built a closed-loop cooling system for the stills, ensuring that the precious limestone water was used only where it mattered most, inside the mash. Despite the infusion of billions of dollars and global distribution, the company made a strategic technical decision. They would never move the production out of Lynchburg. They understood that the industrial terroir, the specific combination of the cave water, the Tennessee air, and the local microflora, was a proprietary technology that couldn't be exported. Jack's Ghost was effectively the chief technical officer. Every expansion, every new warehouse, and every new still had to be calibrated to his original 1866 standard. The brand wasn't just selling a drink. They were selling the preservation of a 19th century machine inside a 21st century wrapper. The runaway boy who had nothing now had his name on more than 15 million cases of whiskey sold every year, a reach that spanned 170 countries. The final chapter of the Jack Daniel's story is defined by a profound, almost poetic irony. In Moore County, Tennessee, the very place where billions of dollars of alcohol are produced every year, it is technically illegal to buy a glass of Jack Daniel's. Lynchburg remains a dry county, a lingering ghost of the Prohibition era that Jack's nephew fought so hard to survive. This creates a strange logistical paradox. You can watch the whiskey being made, you can see the millions of gallons flowing through the charcoal vats, but the only place you can legally buy a bottle is at the distillery's own commemorative shop, thanks to a special act of the state legislature. This disconnect between the industrial output and the local law serves as a permanent reminder of the struggle and tragedy that birthed the brand. Jack's legacy is a masterclass in brand immortality. He died from a kicked safe, a victim of his own perfectionism and temper, yet that same perfectionism created a process so robust that it outlived the death of its founder, the darkness of Prohibition, and the chaos of 2 world wars. The square bottle remains a masterpiece of unit logistics, and the old No. 7 label is a global icon of American industrial consistency. But if you visit Lynchburg today, you won't find a corporate headquarters. You'll find a quiet hollow. You'll find the cave spring, still flowing at a constant 56 degrees, and you'll find the statue of a tiny man standing guard over the water. He looks successful, but he also looks like the boy who never quite found his way back home. The tragic story of Jack Daniel is a reminder that in the world of industry, the man often becomes the machine. Jack sacrificed his life to the pursuit of a pure, filtered spirit, and in doing so, he became a ghost that haunts every bar in the world. His tragedy was his inability to find peace in the world of people, so he sought it in the world of chemistry and carbon. He proved that a runaway with a technical obsession could build something that even time couldn't break. As the last drop of whiskey drips through the sugar maple charcoal today, it follows the same path Jack laid out in 1866. The boy is gone, the safe is rusted, and the preacher is forgotten, but the process remains, a liquid monument to a man who kicked the world and left a mark that will never be mellowed away.